I'm going to tell you a story. There's a man named Il Bang Se, and I met him, and he took me on as his student. And he is a master of both Tao yoga and Zen. And he had the highest level of Zen in Korea and was known all over the place. And I met him in his maybe 70s. Probably 70, you think?
Yes.
Yeah, probably in his 70s. And he took me on and gave me training. There's nothing in the whole world valuable except training. When I was in Russia the third time, I was in a part of Russia that, in general, Russians are really friendly with Americans. But I was in a part of Russia where that wasn't the case because it was Sverdlovsk. It was in the Cold War when Russia when it was a communist country. There were certain cities that were secret cities. I mean, obviously, they weren't secret satellites, but you know what I'm saying. They were secret enclosed cities. And there where the major military production, the secret stuff happened. The secret stuff related to war and defense. I don't know whether anybody here would probably remember this because of your age, but you might have heard about it in history. The biggest, before the Cuban Missile Crisis, at the time when there were two nations fully nuclear armed that could have obliterated each other, really literally hundreds of times in the whole world while they were at it, just by one mistake. There was before that was a big one, pretty famous. Kennedy was in there. Everybody's heard of probably Kennedy, the president. There was something called the Gary Powers incident, where this country had planes that could fly way up in the air and be mostly invisible. And they didn't know it, but the Russians knew that one of these planes was above their secret city, and they shot it down, but they didn't, but the pilot got out and he piloted in to this secret city. You know, just like ejection in a parachute. And so it was a big incident, getting him out and all that. So that was a city where I had an interesting experience about training. So I go down the street, and this man comes up to me, speaks very good English, Russian man, but he looks exactly like, you know, the Men in Black, right? He's like probably a KGB officer, whatever. Now this was after Glasnost and after the wall fell. But it doesn't mean that things were settled in Russia by any means, and particularly in this city. So he came up to me and he said, right in the middle of this town's square, kind of like town square, he said to me, if I see you here tomorrow, you'll be dead. He just looked me, he took his glasses down like that. He said, if I see you here tomorrow, you'll be dead. Well, that was interesting. So there was no way I wasn't going to go back there tomorrow. No way. I was ready to be dead. I was way beyond the illusion that I am in control of whether I'm dead or not. So I went back there and he never showed up. And And then the people around me, there were Russians that were traveling with me and everything. They wanted to know. Yesterday I told you about those two Krishna missionaries that were more at the high level. Well, they had just been there too. They had just been there. I heard that they had just left. It was really interesting, the dynamics of what was going on. So somebody asked me, how do you do what you do? And I said, or why do you do what you do? And I said, I'm only a product of my values and my training. And that's it. I'm nothing else. I'm a product, like life's an art project, right? And we all have our life and our path we walk on. And for me, just having become the art project that I wanted to be, at least at that point, we're always growing our art project and it gets better and better. But it was just a special moment for me that I realized that I had come to the place where I could deal with anything by simply applying my values and my training. So my values told me, definitely show up tomorrow. That were my values. And my training told me that if I had no fear, I would attract no resistance. So, it worked out that way. If it hadn't worked out that way, I thought, maybe I have more to learn here. But in other words, it showed me that I'd reached a certain point. So the reason I told you that is because different people took on giving me training. And training is a really interesting thing because if you're gonna, I'm thinking about like a situation like more in the Middle Ages, all learning, it wasn't in schools, it was in apprenticeship. And I think even today, probably the only really great and authentic learning is through apprenticeship, because you're learning directly. And so there's a famous violin maker named Stradivarius. And his violins today, he was long dead, I mean, it's like hundreds of years ago, but his violins today are worth, like 50, 60,000, maybe 100,000, whatever. But there's a story about him is that he wanted to learn how to make violins when he was a boy. And he went around and looked for who he thought was the greatest violin maker. And he found somebody that he felt was the right one. And he went through 3 stages with this, at least. The first stage was this master violin maker or master musical instrument maker. He made him wait for a while. He would just push him away. He'd just say, I don't know, He'd come up and knock on it and say, I don't know if I'm into that, whatever. So after he saw this persistence, he accepted him. And he was probably a teenager. He wanted to learn how to make violins. This master, he wanted somebody to sweep his floor and go get stuff for him. So he had him doing that for 12 years. And at a certain point, he started teaching him. And at a certain point, he learned everything he could learn through that apprenticeship program. And the master told him, it's time to go now. But that's authentic learning, authentic education, where, it's that the world we live in is all quick. When you're quick, now, this. But we're really only dealing with information or ideas. It's not something that's deep. Well, the deepest education is your own life. Your own life is your art project. And if you're always clear about that, 100% clear, you never take your eye off the fact that you're just here to learn. Not to know anything, but just to learn. So, when Ilbun he wasn't teaching me anything. I was just kind of in a group. And it was good. I was learning stuff. It was good. And then one day, he was behind a tree. We were at some retreat somewhere in California, and he was behind a tree, and I heard him singing, and he was singing the Heart Sutra in Korean. Can you send me text me or email me do we have the audio file, or we just have the sheet?
We just have
With the notes.
English sheet.
With the notes, and it
Yeah,
has both, it has the English and the Korean?
The English words are on the staff, like how you would see it.
Yeah, will you text or email me that when we're done? I want to share it with somebody. So, I never heard that before, and it was really beautiful. Have you ever taught these people that?
No, some people may have, but that's next retreat.
Do you know the words? Go ahead, let's sing it. I'll have to follow you and so
Mahabanya Paramita Shim Kyum. The Venerable Bodhisattva Kwanseum, performing his meditation in the deep Prajnaparamita, thought thus: there are 5 thieves, and these by their nature are empty. Oh, my friend, form is emptiness, and emptiness is form. Emptiness is not different from form, and form is not different from emptiness. Oh, my friend, all things have the character of emptiness. They have no beginning and no end. They are not pure, neither are they impure. They do not increase, neither do they decrease.
That's pretty good.
That's verse 1.
What'd you
Just
say?
3 verses, that's verse 1.
Yeah, that's verse 1. So you can learn that. Hey, if they want to learn more, when could they learn that?
In March.
Hey, how
last
about
week
that?
of March.
Didn't know it.
Sing
We were setting
every day.
we were setting it up for an ad. But there you go. Yeah, that's that retreat is so
And the
powerful.
arrow you did last night, Dahlia.
So,
Getting it in there.
so I heard him singing this from behind the tree, and I had no idea what he was singing. It was just so beautiful, and so I kind of crept up and saw what he was doing. He was doing some simple movement, very simple movement. So I wanted him to teach me what he was doing. So after a while, he agreed to do it, and he started out with a story. So I'm just going to tell you a story. He said a long time ago in China, well, when he was a teenager, I don't know any of you know enough about Chinese history to know about the time before Chiang Kai-shek, during Chiang Kai-shek, after Chiang Kai-shek, and then Mao Zedong, and then the whole thing. It's like these are periods of history. They're also related to how Western powers were relating to China. So when he was 17 years old, it was before Chiang Kai-shek. The reason Taiwan exists as a separate country is because Chiang Kai-shek lost the battle with Mao for control of China. And he had to flee with his troops to Taiwan. And the reason it's a big sticking point in China wanting the United States to stop recognizing Taiwan because they say it's part of China is all because of this unresolved history. And so Chiang Kai-shek would have been the democratic one, you know, in that sense that dictators are democratic rather than dictators who aren't democratic and don't claim to be. They claim to be something else, like Mao Zedong claimed to be something else. So he went there before that, and China was in chaos, and the Western powers had divided it up, and it was just chaos. And so chaos worked really well for him because he was a teenager, and he could just walk right through the chaos. And he walked into the mountains where the Taoist masters lived and practiced. And he studied with them. He spent years being with them. And they taught him their way. So here's what they told him. They told him a long time ago in China, we just meditated. Long time before that. We just meditated. We never had a problem. We just meditated. And our field was so strong that nobody ever bothered us. But then some of the people who were around us and helped us, this, that, and the other, they started being attacked by thieves in the forest. And they didn't have this field that just was a protection all by itself, almost like an invisible, makes you invisible. It's too bright of a mirror on an energy level. And so, we started teaching them some movements that allowed them to defeat people who wanted to rob them. And the first school of that was Shaolin and Kung Fu, and all of the martial arts, including Tai Chi and all of them, came out of this time in China. Now this was, I don't know, at least hundreds of years, if not more, before, the time of modern, the last century. When this first arose, it was a practical thing. These Taoist monks developed a form of self-defense, and they gave it to people. They didn't need it themselves. And so, after a while, some of the people that were practicing this new form of self-defense, it was based on Taoist principles and energies. They wanted to know more. But they were householders and, people had families and stuff. And so they really weren't able to dedicate as much to just being still and doing nothing as Taoist monks. So they developed an in-between, and they taught it to them, and it gave them the ability to develop. It was like a new technology. It was like a new liberation technology. It allowed them to keep having a regular life in business, in the world, and a family, and yet develop the same power of presence that the monks had sitting. So it was a new technology. It was an in-between. between thing. And everything, of course, evolves out of a practical need. And of course, the way the force works, the force creates situations that produce practical needs so new liberation technologies can come into the world. That's the way it works. That's how one came. I've taught you one. That's how I came. It was time. So, this was called, can you guess? No. This is intermediate form, Mursshud. Okay, so I've done Mursshud movements, and I've just said this is Mursshud to people, and people here that I've known have done Mursshud, but it has a much bigger, a much deeper, it's a much broader practice. And I don't feel it was possible to teach this practice until what I call Rudy 2.0 came along. In other words, for people who have been here, a lot before, for years before, I've always talked about the most important chakra is the root chakra. I've always taught Rudy's simple practice, just one practice, double breathing practice, and method of how to relate to it by working in the world, by being in the world, and using the energies of working in the world to discover tensions and then uses practice to break them down. It's a very simple method. It's all in the first third of spiritual cannibalism. But I always tell people it's like what's important is the root. It's not the third eye's not important. The heart's not important. The crown's not important. It's the root that's important. Because the root is connected to the earth. The magnetic core of the earth is the same frequency as the root. Okay, well, once the more advanced version came out, then it was possible to teach something called 4321. And a lot of people here don't know about this form of practice, so I'm not going to go into the detail of it. I'm just going to bypass the detail and go to the essential part. So, let's see. Have I taught the pumping? Have I taught that?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
No,
I taught the
not
pumping.
us here.
First day?
I taught the pumping here or didn't?
No,
Okay.
you didn't teach it. You might have showed it a little bit, but you
Well,
haven't.
no, I think I showed a couple people at the house one time.
Yeah.
All right, so let me think about how to do this. I'm gonna go pee, and then everybody's, in your own time, stand up and just kind of get comfortable, just feeling the magnetic core of the earth and your root. And just do that, and I'll be right back. So glad you're here.